The morning sky churned with an ominous darkness that seemed to mirror the storm brewing in one woman's life. Crystal McDowell had no idea that August 25, 2017 would be the last day anyone would see her alive, as Hurricane Harvey barreled toward the Texas coast. Crystal made a decision that would change everything. She left her home that Friday morning, walking into what would become one of the most baffling disappearances in recent memory. This isn't just another missing person case. This is a story where nature's fury collided with human deception, where floodwaters would wash away evidence and complicate an investigation that already had more twists than anyone could imagine. By the time the storm passed, investigators would realize they weren't just fighting against time and weather. They were up against a killer who thought the perfect storm would be the perfect cover. What you're about to hear is the complete story of Crystal McDowell's disappearance, a case that would expose the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of what appeared to be an ordinary life. 3 men would emerge as suspects. One would ultimately face justice, but the path to that courtroom would be anything but straightforward. Crystal McDowell was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. Those who knew her described a woman with an infectious spirit, someone who knew exactly what she wanted from life and wasn't afraid to go after it. She had built a successful career as a flight attendant, traveling the world and embracing what friends called her gypsy soul. But by 2017, Crystal had traded the skies for real estate, diving headfirst into a new chapter of her professional life. At 43, Crystal was a mother to 2 children, 8-year-old Madden and 5-year-old Maui. She was also navigating the complexities of post-divorce life. Her marriage to Steve McDowell had officially ended just months earlier in June 2017 after 10 years together. What many described as an amicable split had left Crystal in an unusual living arrangement. She was staying in the master bedroom of the house she had helped Steve purchase, while he had moved upstairs to a different room. It was temporary, they said, just until Crystal's townhouse renovation was complete. But beneath this seemingly peaceful coexistence, there were undercurrents that few people fully understood. Crystal had recently begun dating Paul Hargrave, a local jewelry store owner. Their relationship was still new, just a few weeks old, but Crystal seemed genuinely happy. So happy, in fact, that she had posted on social media just days before her disappearance, declaring she had never been happier in her entire life. The timing of Crystal's vanishing couldn't have been worse. Hurricane Harvey was bearing down on the Texas Gulf Coast with unprecedented fury. Weather forecasters were predicting catastrophic flooding, and residents across the region were making final preparations for what would become one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. Grocery store shelves had been stripped bare. Gas stations were running dry. Everyone who could leave had already evacuated. Crystal, however, had chosen to stay. She had responsibilities, people who depended on her. As a newly licensed real estate agent, she had clients to consider. As a mother, she had children to protect. The storm was supposed to last several days, and Crystal wanted to make sure her family was safe and prepared. That Friday morning started like any other. Crystal sent text messages to Paul, her new boyfriend. They exchanged their usual good morning pleasantries, making plans for when the storm passed. But as the hours ticked by, something changed. Paul replied to Crystal's messages, but she never responded back. At first, he assumed she was simply busy preparing for the hurricane. Everyone was scrambling to secure their homes and gather supplies, but Crystal's silence was completely out of character. She was the type of person who stayed in constant communication with the people she cared about. Her Uncle Jeff, who had raised her after her parents died when she was just 11 years old. received messages from Crystal every single morning. She would check in throughout the day, sharing updates about her life, her work, her children. Jeff described his niece as one of the most responsible people he had ever known. Crystal never lost contact with her family. As Friday turned into Saturday, concern began to mount. The storm had arrived with a vengeance, dumping unprecedented amounts of rain across southeast Texas. Baytown, where Crystal lived, was taking a direct hit. Streets were flooding, power lines were down, and communication was becoming increasingly difficult. But even accounting for the chaos of the hurricane, Crystal's complete radio silence was alarming. Steve McDowell, Crystal's ex-husband, told family members that Crystal was supposed to have arrived at their house on Friday morning. He claimed she had sent him a text message at 7:01 that morning, saying she was on her way and asking if he had water. The message suggested she might stay with him and the children since it looked like the storm would be severe. But according to Steve, Crystal never showed up. Uncle Jeff became increasingly worried as Saturday stretched into Sunday with no word from Crystal. He began reaching out to relatives and friends, trying to piece together Crystal's last known movements. That's when he learned something that made his blood run cold. Multiple people told him the same thing, they just knew something wasn't right. Crystal would never disappear without explanation, especially not when her children needed her. The timing was catastrophic from an investigative standpoint. Hurricane Harvey was wreaking havoc across the entire region. Sheriff's deputies were dealing with their own flooded homes while simultaneously trying to coordinate rescue operations. Some investigators had lost everything they owned to the storm, yet they still showed up for work every single day, determined to find Crystal McDowell. District Attorney Cheryl Leak would later describe the challenges they faced. The flooding was so severe that normal investigative procedures became nearly impossible. Crime scene labs were underwater, evidence collection was compromised, transportation was limited. But despite these overwhelming obstacles, law enforcement remained committed to finding Crystal. They understood something that Crystal's family already knew. Mothers don't just disappear, especially not during natural disasters when their children need them most. As the floodwaters began to recede, investigators started to piece together a timeline of Crystal's final days. What they discovered painted a picture of a woman who was genuinely excited about her future. She had been making plans with Paul to travel to Europe. She had invited him to join her family on an upcoming cruise. Though there was one complication, her ex-husband Steve was also supposed to be on that cruise. This detail would prove to be more significant than anyone initially realized. Paul had expressed concern about the awkwardness of joining a family vacation that included Crystal's ex-husband. He had asked Crystal if Steve could perhaps skip the trip. According to Paul, Crystal had approached Steve about not attending the cruise, and Steve's reaction had been intense. He was visibly upset about being excluded from what he had apparently viewed as an opportunity to reconcile with Crystal. The investigation was further complicated by Crystal's extensive social circle. As a former flight attendant and current real estate agent, she knew people all across Texas and beyond. She was described as extremely social, someone who maintained friendships from every chapter of her life. This meant that investigators had dozens of potential witnesses to interview, relationships to explore, and alibis to verify. 3 men quickly emerged as persons of interest in Crystal's disappearance. There was Steve McDowell, the ex-husband who still shared a home with Crystal and seemed to harbor hopes of reconciliation. There was Paul Hargrave, the new boyfriend who had been one of the last people to see Crystal alive. And somewhat surprisingly, there was Uncle Jeff himself, whose emotional involvement in the case and tendency to interfere with the investigation had begun to raise questions among law enforcement. Each of these men had a different story about Crystal's final hours. Each claimed to want nothing more than to see her returned safely. But as investigators would soon discover, the truth was far more complicated than any of them were willing to admit. The discovery of Crystal's abandoned Mercedes in a motel parking lot would mark the beginning of the end of this tragic mystery. The discovery came from an unexpected source. While law enforcement was struggling against flooded roads and damaged communication systems, Crystal's own family and friends had organized their own search efforts. They knew the areas Crystal frequented, understood her habits and routines in ways that even the most dedicated investigators couldn't match. It was this intimate knowledge that led them to the breakthrough everyone had been hoping for. Crystal's black Mercedes was found sitting in the parking lot of a Motel 6, its doors unlocked, and keys resting conspicuously on the center console. Sheriff Hawthorne arrived at the scene and immediately knew something was wrong. In his years of law enforcement experience, he had never encountered an abandoned vehicle staged so obviously. Everything about the scene screamed setup. The car's placement seemed almost theatrical. It was positioned in plain sight, as if someone wanted it to be discovered. But whoever had left it there hadn't anticipated the massive flooding that Harvey would bring. The rising waters had trapped the Mercedes in the parking lot, making it impossible for anyone to drive it away. What had likely been planned as a temporary hiding spot had become a permanent crime scene. Processing the vehicle presented unique challenges. The flood damage had contaminated potential evidence, and the crime lab facilities in Houston were dealing with their own hurricane-related problems. Many of the technicians and analysts had lost their homes to the storm, yet they continued working around the clock to help solve this case. The dedication was remarkable, but the practical limitations were undeniable. Sheriff's deputies began canvassing nearby businesses, hoping to find security cameras that might have captured whoever had abandoned Crystal's car. The investigation was painstaking work made even more difficult by the storm's aftermath. Many businesses had suffered flood damage, and their surveillance systems were offline. But investigators persevered, checking every possible angle. Their persistence paid off when they discovered footage from a Shell gas station adjacent to the motel. The grainy video showed a figure emerging from what appeared to be Crystal's Mercedes and walking to a nearby trash receptacle. The person seemed to be disposing of something, pushing it deep into the container with deliberate force. Even more telling was the way this individual kept glancing toward the motel, as if checking to ensure the car was still where it had been left. The footage was far from perfect, but experienced investigators could make out enough details to identify the person as Steve McDowell. This was the first concrete evidence linking Crystal's ex-husband to her disappearance, and it fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Additional surveillance footage from the motel's own cameras showed someone parking Crystal's car and walking away. Again, the figure bore a strong resemblance to Steve McDowell. For investigators who had been working with limited physical evidence, these videos represented a major breakthrough. They finally had something concrete to work with. But Steve wasn't making things easy for law enforcement. When brought in for questioning, he maintained his story that Crystal had never arrived at his house that Friday morning. He insisted he had no idea what had happened to her and volunteered to help with the investigation in any way possible. His demeanor was cooperative, even friendly, but investigators noticed inconsistencies in his account. Polygraph tests were administered to both Steve and Paul Hargrave. The results were revealing. While Paul's test results were inconclusive, Steve failed his examination decisively. When confronted with these results, Steve's attorney advised him to stop cooperating with the investigation. The friendly, helpful ex-husband suddenly became evasive and defensive. Meanwhile, investigators were learning more about the dynamics of Crystal and Steve's relationship. What had been described as an amicable divorce was actually far more complicated. Family members revealed that Steve had never truly accepted the end of their marriage. He harbored fantasies about reconciliation and had been devastated when Crystal began dating someone else. Crystal's Aunt Cindy provided crucial insights into Steve's behavior. She described how he would cater to Crystal's every need, rubbing her feet when she was tired, brushing her hair when she asked. His devotion bordered on obsession, and Crystal's independence had been gradually eroding under the weight of his neediness. When Crystal finally decided to end their marriage, Steve's world had collapsed. The upcoming family cruise had taken on enormous significance in Steve's mind. He had apparently purchased matching white outfits for himself and Crystal, planning to propose to her during the trip. In his fantasy, they would remarry and start fresh. When Crystal uninvited him from the cruise to make room for her new boyfriend, it shattered his delusions about their future together. Financial pressures were also mounting in Steve's life. Crystal had been his primary source of financial support, and she had recently decided to cut him off. Friends described how Steve had been spending money recklessly, making purchases he couldn't afford, while Crystal covered his expenses. When she finally said she couldn't continue supporting his lifestyle, Steve faced the loss of not just his ex-wife, but his entire way of life. The investigation took another crucial turn when deputies discovered additional surveillance footage from a nearby Walmart. This video showed Steve purchasing a bicycle on the day Crystal disappeared. The timing was significant because it provided a potential explanation for how Steve had gotten home after abandoning Crystal's car at the motel. The bicycle purchase occurred after Crystal's Mercedes had been spotted at the motel, suggesting premeditation rather than a spontaneous act. Investigators were building a compelling circumstantial case, but they still lacked the direct evidence needed to make an arrest. Steve seemed to understand this, growing more confident and arrogant with each passing day. He would arrive at the sheriff's office for questioning and sit for hours, calmly denying any involvement in Crystal's disappearance. His attitude suggested he believed he was untouchable. The psychological pressure was mounting on all sides. District Attorney Cheryl Leak knew Steve was guilty, but struggled with the knowledge that knowing something and proving it in court were two very different challenges. The case was consuming enormous resources, and the community was demanding answers. Meanwhile, Steve retained custody of his and Crystal's two young children, a situation that made everyone uncomfortable. The breakthrough came when investigators realized they needed to apply different pressure to Steve. Rather than continuing to focus solely on gathering evidence, they decided to remove the children from his care. Working with Family Protective Services, they arranged for Madden and Maui to be placed with Crystal's Aunt Cindy. The psychological impact on Steve was immediate and devastating. Losing custody of the children represented Steve's final connection to his old life. Without Crystal and without the kids, he had nothing left to lose. Investigators hoped this realization would finally break through his defenses and lead to a confession. They were betting everything on the theory that a man with nothing left to protect might finally tell the truth. The gamble was risky. If Steve decided to run or harm himself, they would lose their only real suspect and any chance of finding Crystal's body. But Sheriff Hawthorne made the difficult decision to allow Steve to go home one final time, giving him the night to consider his options. It was an unprecedented move that would either solve the case or let a killer escape justice forever. The night Steve spent at home would prove to be his last as a free man. Early the next morning, he called his daughter Krista, who was attending Texas A&M University, asking her to come home immediately. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. When Krista arrived in the pre-dawn darkness, She found her father in a state she had never seen before. Steve was methodical that morning, almost businesslike as he handed over photo albums, financial documents, and even the keys to his prized Mustang to Krista. It seemed like her father was simply trying to get his affairs in order before facing whatever consequences awaited him. She had defended him throughout the investigation, believing completely in his innocence. But then the conversation took a chilling turn. Steve looked at his daughter and said something that would haunt her forever. He mentioned that investigators had told him they would reduce his punishment if he revealed where Crystal's body was located. When Krista protested that he couldn't possibly know such information, Steve's response was devastating. He looked away and broke down completely. In that moment, Krista realized the horrible truth. Her father knew exactly where Crystal McDowell was because he had put her there. The man she had defended, the father she had loved and trusted, was a killer. When police arrived to take Steve into custody, Krista collapsed to her knees and wept. At the sheriff's office, Steve finally began to talk. The confession came slowly, painfully, but it came nonetheless. He described how Crystal had returned home that Friday morning after spending the night with Paul. An argument had erupted immediately. Steve was furious that she had stayed out all night, devastated by her obvious happiness with another man. In his statement, Steve claimed that Crystal had become aggressive during their confrontation. He said she didn't love him anymore, that she had made that abundantly clear. But investigators believed the truth was simpler and more sinister. Steve McDowell had made a calculated decision. If he couldn't have Crystal, nobody could. The details Steve provided were horrific. He described strangling Crystal from behind, catching her completely off guard. She had no chance to defend herself, no opportunity to fight back. After killing the mother of his children, Steve had methodically disposed of her body, wrapping it in trash bags before driving to a remote wooded area. Steve led investigators to the location where he had dumped Crystal's remains. The site was densely wooded and difficult to access, chosen specifically because Steve believed it would never be discovered. Recovery efforts were complicated by the thick vegetation and the decomposition that had occurred during the weeks since Crystal's murder. When Crystal's body was finally recovered, the case officially became a homicide prosecution. Steve McDowell was arrested and charged with murder, ending months of speculation and bringing some measure of closure to Crystal's devastated family. The trial that followed would reveal the full extent of Steve's deception and obsession. Despite his confession, he attempted to claim that Crystal's death had been accidental, the result of what he described as a spontaneous embrace that had gotten out of control. The jury didn't believe him. After 5 days of testimony and evidence, it took the jury less than 4 hours to reach their verdict. Steve McDowell was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 50 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2042 when he is in his 70s. The tragedy extended far beyond Crystal's death. 2 young children had lost both parents, their mother to murder, their father to prison. 8-year-old Madden and 5-year-old Maui would grow up knowing the devastating truth about how their family had been destroyed. Crystal McDowell's story serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence can lurk behind the facade of even the most seemingly normal relationships. Her death occurred during one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in American history. But the real storm had been brewing in her own home for years. Hurricane Harvey eventually passed, leaving behind billions of dollars in damage and forever changing the Texas Gulf Coast. But for Crystal's family and friends, the storm's most devastating casualty was a vibrant woman whose only crime was trying to build a new life for herself and her children. Today, Crystal's children are thriving under the care of family friends who have provided them with the stability and love they deserve. They carry their mother's memory with them, remembering her infectious spirit and her determination to always do what was right. This case stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers who refused to give up, even when facing seemingly impossible circumstances. Despite flooded crime labs, damaged evidence, and personal losses from the hurricane, they persevered until justice was served. Crystal McDowell's story didn't end with Hurricane Harvey, but her legacy lives on in the lives she touched and the children she loved more than anything in the world.